Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first National Emergency Coalition conference call of 2016. I'm going to go ahead and turn the call over now to Bishop E.W. Jackson, the president of STAND.
Thank you, Bill. Happy New Year, everybody, and thank you for joining us. This is a very, very special call because I, probably like all of you, have been profoundly concerned about Islam and the things that are happening around it and the things that seem to be coming to America as a result of it. And I keep hearing politicians and others say, well, Islam is a peaceful religion and this, that, and the other. And the studying and reading I've been doing has convinced me that most Americans have no clue what Islam really is, just don't have a clue. And one of my good friends happens to be an expert on Islam, and we're going to bring him on in just a second. And he's going to take 30 minutes, longer than we normally give, because what we want him to really do is give you a lecture, give you a background on Islam so that you have a better understanding of it. He may even include some materials that you can go read further, because obviously he can't give you everything in 30 minutes. But then we're going to open it up for questions and comments, and we would encourage you to get in queue early, because we expect a whole lot of people on this call, and they're jumping in here even as I'm speaking, and we expect a whole lot of questions. So get in queue as soon as you hear something. I want to get some more clarity on that. Get in queue, and he'll be happy to answer the question. So we're planning to go until 1. We realize some of you probably can't stay with us that long. Stay with us as long as you can. If you can stay the full hour, do that. We've extended to the full hour to give him plenty of time to share with you what he needs to share and to give you plenty of time to ask questions, because the goal of this call is when you leave it, if you didn't have much of an understanding of Islam, just sort of knew of it as a religion, you leave it knowing a lot more about it than you did before. So let's say a word of prayer, and I'll bring on our special guest today. Father, in the name of Jesus, we thank you so much for this great nation, the United States of America. Lord God, you said the nations that forget God shall be turned into hell. We don't want that for America. We want our country to be a shining city on a hill. We want our country to be a land of freedom and opportunity and prosperity and hope and inspiration. We want our country to be the envy of the world. And Lord, we believe that vision for America is being attacked viciously, even from the White House. Even at this very moment, the President of the United States is standing up, trying to, in effect, by fiat, undermine the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, the Bill of Rights that our founding fathers gave us, not to give us rights, but to acknowledge those rights in our Constitution. And he is busy trying to say, no, those rights don't exist, and I can do whatever I want to do with them. So, Lord, from the White House all the way down to local governments, with laws that are being passed in the dark of night, and marriage being redefined, and the Lord, everything from the dismantling of our military to the dismantling of our families, our country is in deep trouble. We need an awakening, oh God. We desperately need an awakening. And part of awakening is to know more, to understand more. You said, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. We want people to have the knowledge that allows them to make informed decisions and to assess and analyze things in an intelligent way. Not just hear people say, oh, well, this is that, and that's it. We just accept that and we go on. But we want information that allows us to analyze and come to conclusions that are rational when we're dealing with these critical issues that may affect the survival of our country. And Lord, one of those critical issues is the nature of Islam. Refugees are being brought in from Islamic countries by the tens of thousands every single day. None of us really knows how many are being brought here. But Lord God, we know that some of those people who are coming here are not coming with good intentions and good feelings toward this country. They're coming in to destroy it. And we pray that you'll help us to understand what Islam is, why it is a danger and a threat to us, and how we can go about combating what is happening in our country right now. We don't want to become Europe. We don't want enclaves where Sharia law is ruling. We don't want our courts and our judges deciding that we're going to apply Sharia law to the beating of a woman or to the killing of a child who dishonored his parents. Lord, we want our Constitution to be the supreme law of the land, and we want to remain one nation under the Judeo-Christian God, not this God called Allah, which is no God at all. So, Father, we thank you for Bill Federer. We thank you for the anointing that you've given him to share with us the truth. And we pray that you will use him not only on this call, but use him a mighty way all over this nation to awaken Americans to the truth of the dangers and the threats that we face, so that we know how to appropriately address them. And we give you the praise, the honor, and the glory for it, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, folks, my guest is William Federer, and Bill is a prolific author and writer and lecturer, lectures all over the country. I often go places where I'm speaking, and lo and behold, who is there as a major speaker? It's Bill Federer. Because people understand that he brings something to the table that we desperately need, which is knowledge and understanding. And in this case, because he's an expert on American history as well, but in this case on Islam, its history, its background, its culture. So you can read his entire bio in the material that we sent out. It's extensive. But without any further delay, let me bring on our guest today, William Federer. Bill, thank you so much for taking time out. I know what your schedule is like. I see you all over the country, so I know this is no small thing for you, and I want you to know how deeply we appreciate it. Take about 30 minutes, Bill, and try to walk us through, assuming that we know little or nothing of Islam, try to walk us through an understanding of it, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments for about the last 20 minutes, okay?
Oh, thank you, Bishop. Well, it's an honor to be with you. And, well, whenever we see killings, and there are politicians that say those killers do not represent true Islam, yet the killers themselves are yelling Allahu Akbar, and they are saying that they do represent true Islam. Who can tell us what true Islam is? One person, Muhammad. Muhammad was the best Muslim that ever lived. His life is called the Sunnah, which means the way or the example. And Muhammad's life, when we put it under a microscope, went through 3 stages. He was a religious leader, then a political leader, then a military leader. And so he starts off, he was born in 570 A.D., his father dies before he's born. His mother died when he's 6 years old. His grandfather and guardian died when he was 8 years old. So he was orphaned and taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, who was a merchant, and he would take Muhammad on camel rides. They would go to different cities, hear about the different religions, some of the Zoroastrian, Persian beliefs, that paradise was filled full of virgins, some of the Jewish oral traditions, some of the Christian beliefs, and even Encyclopedia Britannica stated that Muhammad heard of Christianity chiefly through apocryphal and heretical sources, so he thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. But then Muhammad could not read, and this is not uncommon for that area of the world. The Jews and Christians were the exception. They could read. They were called people of the book. So Muhammad has his faith. He's very excited, goes into the pagan city of Mecca, and for 12 years, from 610 A.D. to 622 A.D., he only makes 70 converts. And then he gets confrontational, hangs around the square building called the Kaaba, and he begins to insult the pagans and tell them that they're going to burn in hell. Well, the pagans decide that they want to get rid of him, but they can't because of his rich uncle Abu Talib. Well, Abu Talib dies in 619 A.D., and so now Muhammad has no protector. The people of Mecca decide to chase Muhammad out of town, and he has no place to go. So he tries going to a city called Al-Taif. They don't want him, so they pelt him with rocks and stones, and the little kids jeer and chase Muhammad out of town. And so he is, in a sense, a Muslim refugee. And so he goes north 210 miles to a Jewish city called Medina. The Jews are nice. They let Muhammad in as a Muslim immigrant. He goes into the minority neighborhoods and he begins to organize a following. We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community. He gets a following, and then he goes back to the Jews and he pressures them to accommodate him and his followers politically. And so the Jews make a treaty with Muhammad, and now he is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then something happens. Muhammad's followers in Mecca, they get pushy, argumentative, confrontational, and threatening, the way some of his followers are today. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. They are Muslim refugees with no place to go. Well, the Jews are nice. They let him into Medina. They go to Muhammad's neighborhoods, and Muhammad begins to allow his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. So where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, Muhammad's attitude was, if they take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. And so Muhammad gets a whole chapter of the Quran on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. To Surah 8, chapter 8, he gets a fifth of the booty. And so the Meccans, in 627 A.D., send 10,000 soldiers to Medina to stop Muhammad and his men from robbing the caravans. And it turns out Muhammad's version of roadside bombs and IEDs was he dug potholes and trenches all around the city of Medina, which rendered the superior cavalry of the Meccans useless, because you can't charge your horse and camel across a field full of potholes. And so throws off the battle strategy. Muhammad goes to some of the tribes at night, and he bribes them, and they slip away. Goes to some of the other pagan tribes at night, and he threatens them, and they slip away. Sort of the Chicago politics, the bribe or the bullet. Then it gets freezing cold for a week. The rest of the Meccans lose heart and decide to retreat and bring their troops home. And it leaves a power vacuum, very similar to a year and a half ago when our president declared war in Iraq and Afghanistan over, and he brings all of our troops home, and he leaves a power vacuum. Did they become more peaceful after that? Well, no. And in Muhammad's case, he was emboldened that his enemies were cowards and unable to subdue him. He goes back into the Jewish city of Medina, and he says that he's offended at something one of the Jewish tribes did. And he was smart enough politically to pick on the one the other two Jewish tribes didn't like. And so they sort of stood by while Muhammad whipped his followers into a jihad frenzy. They attacked that Jewish neighborhood and confiscated all of that Jewish tribe's property and chases them out of town. Now there's two Jewish tribes left. And the second tribe does something that offends Muhammad and his followers, and they whip into frenzy, and they attack that neighborhood, confiscate their property, chase them out of town. This actually set a precedent in Islam called hudna, which means when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. And that third Jewish tribe, Muhammad bottles them in their neighborhood. When they finally surrender, he brings them into the market and chops off their heads. So within just simply 5 years after Muhammad comes as an immigrant into the Jewish city of Medina, there's not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They've been chased out, killed, or enslaved. And within 5 years of Muhammad's death, every pre-existing culture in Arabia was wiped out. And so we see it's a three-step process: immigrate, increase, eliminate. Sort of like Caesar's three steps: Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. So Muhammad's was, first you immigrate into the host country as a religious refugee, and then you increase the number of your followers in the minority neighborhoods where they feel victimized, and you get involved politically, demanding that the host country change its laws to accommodate you. And then they get offended, and they get militant, and they eliminate the previous culture. And it's a very predictable pattern. There's 1,400 years of watching this happen. And I may have shared before of speaking across the country, and I, have people come up afterwards and tell me local stories of, but Detroit is an interesting one, where there was a lady that had a ministry to pregnant moms, and she shows up at the Muslim house with a present. Well, out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom, and another pregnant Muslim mom, and another pregnant Muslim mom, all pregnant by the same man. He's practicing Sharia law in his house. And then one guy says, oh, Fazl bought a bunch of houses on the street, has a wife in each one. They go down to the welfare office, say the husband's not around, and they get these welfare checks, and he visits these wives, and the more kids they have, the larger the checks get. He's living like a king, and all the kids playing in the middle of the street are his kids. He's practicing Sharia law on his block. And then they take over several more blocks and vote in the school board, and like Hamtramck, Michigan now has a majority Muslim city council, and now they have their minarets and their calls to prayer 5 times a day, no different than Pakistan. And so they sort of come in. In nature, we call it a domestic species and invasive species. And so you have domestic ideologies, which is doing to others as you would have them doing to you, and invasive ideologies. And then another interesting part is there's a psychological term called projection, and it's called blame shifting. It's like a man blames his wife for provoking him, and he turns into a wife beater. So he's the wife beater, but he's blaming his wife. It's like a bully on a playground, pushes all the other kids around, and then when one finally stands up to him, he tells the teacher, well, he started it. And so Islam does this where they push, and then when finally somebody says, I want to defend myself, then they say, well, you started it, and we're justified in attacking you. And so that's how they would attack, and they conquered all of Syria, which used to be Christian. Syria was the first country that was completely Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. And then they conquered Egypt. Egypt was completely Christian, evangelized by Mark. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. There used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century. They were all conquered by the Muslims. And then in the year 711, they conquer Spain. And then they finally are stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 A.D., exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 A.D. So they go from Arabia to Paris in a military campaign. They enslave over 1 million Europeans. There's whole Catholic orders in Europe through the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians, who would raise donations at church and go under a white flag to ransom back your friend who was captured by the Muslims. In 846 A.D., the Muslims raided Rome, Italy, and they trashed the graves of St. Peter and St. Paul. But then they enslaved 180 million Africans, castrate the men, make them eunuchs, sell the women into sex trafficking. Muhammad was a white Arab. There are hadiths that talk about when they lift his arms to pray, they'd see the whiteness of his armpits, and somebody's riding on his donkey to early morning prayer, rubs up against Muhammad. He said, I saw the whiteness of the prophet's thigh, and Muhammad owned African slaves. Excuse me. Now, Islam is a religion of peace, but their definition of the word peace is different than ours. Our definition of the word peace is when people get along. Their definition is when the whole world submits to the will of Allah, there will be peace. So to them, world peace means world Islam. That's their goal. They want to have the whole world submit to Allah, and then there's peace. Now, a moderate Muslim thinks the world is going to submit to Allah later, maybe in the distant future, and since it's so far off, they really don't take it serious. We call them moderate Muslims. But then you have Muslims that think the world is supposed to submit to Allah now, and they're really excited, and we call them radical Muslims. And so they believe that the world's supposed to submit to Allah now. Now, the dilemma for us in the West is the more we bend over backwards in unprecedented ways to show ourselves tolerant and nice and respectful, the moderate Muslim begins to rethink and says, this has never, ever happened before. Or we can go into a Muslim country and they pay us $2,500 a month free, and they give us free housing and free clothes and free welfare, free everything. This has never happened before. Maybe the world is, in fact, submitting to Allah now rather than later. And so they gravitate from the future peaceful moderate camp into the fundamental now camp, which is the violent camp. So all of our efforts to show ourselves really nice is actually creating more violence. It's sort of like the law of the jungle. And if the lion's chasing the zebra and the zebra trips and falls, does the lion give him a head start again? No, he pounces. And so in Islam, they have a concept. When your enemy shows weakness, that is Allah giving them to you. And anyway, now another point is Muhammad had a dream 2 nights in a row of him marrying the 6-year-old daughter of his general Abu Bakr. And so the general says, well, you're the prophet. Here she is. And she became one of Muhammad's favorite wives. He had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives, slave wives, and concubines. Well, when Muhammad dies, Aisha's father, Abu Bakr, becomes the first caliph. He is the first supreme leader in Islam. And the area that the caliph controls is the caliphate. It's an ISIS. It's an Islamic state. And so Abu Bakr there's a bunch of Muslims that want to leave, and he says, you cannot leave. It's called the Ridda laws, R-I-D-D-A, apostasy laws. And so he kills thousands. And so this set a precedent in Islam that you're free to join. You just can't leave, sort of like Hotel California. And so there's Muslim imams that have even said that if there were no apostasy laws, Islam would have ended with Muhammad. I talked to a Muslim who had converted to becoming a Christian. His name's Elijah Abraham. He has livingoasis.org ministries. He says that if you remove the Ridda laws, 90% of Muslims would leave overnight. So they're constantly under fear that their own family member would murder them if they leave Islam. So it's a peer pressure religion. That's why when you see them praying in the street, it's a public thing because it's a tremendous amount of peer pressure. If somebody wanted to stand up and said, no, I'm not bowing, right? It's we view it as like a team spirit. It's like a gang mentality. Anyway, so Abu Bakr is murdered. The next caliph is Caliph Umar, and he conquers through Syria and in North Africa, and he's murdered. The next caliph is Caliph Uthman. He's murdered. And the next caliph is Ali. Now, Ali is married to Muhammad's daughter Fatima. And the followers of Ali are called Shi'ali or Shiite. So 10% of Muslims are Shiite followers of Ali, and they're mostly in Iran. 90% of Muslims are followers of Abu Bakr, who knew the way because he was a general with Muhammad, and he fought in all of Muhammad's battles. So he calls himself a Sunni, which is Muhammad's life was called a Sunnah. And so we have 90% of Muslims are Sunni, and they're spread around the world, and that's what Saudi Arabia and Turkey and those other countries are. But Iran is Shiite. Well, for this brief moment, Ali is the leader of the Shiite and the Sunni, but he does not do vengeance and kill the killers of Uthman. So Uthman's relatives kill Ali. They charge and they have spears and they put little Quran verses on the end of the spears, and so Ali's men don't want to fight back and hit that. Anyway, so then Ali is murdered, and so this starts the division between the Sunnis and the Shiites. So the Shiites are so upset that their Ali was murdered, and then Ali's son Hussein was murdered, and they were poisoned and shoved in wells and so forth. So in Iran, every year they have a shura where they get the men together in the boys, and they take knives and they hit their heads so they bleed down their face because Hussein was killed in the head, and they get in the town square and they moan and groan and whip themselves into an emotional frenzy to stir up the hate, so they keep the hate against the Sunnis alive. And so this breaks out from time to time into wars. In the 1970s, millions were killed between Iran and Iraq, fighting between the Shiites and the Sunnis. And now we're beginning to see that maybe this is going to be stirred up again. But that's a whole another thing. Is this making sense?
Absolutely. Yes, it certainly is.
Well, and just to continue the progression, there's actually two sets of verses in the Quran based on the two cities Muhammad lived in. When he was in Mecca, the verses he got were just religious verses, and they're relatively more peaceful. The verses he gets in Medina are political and military, and they're more violent. And the later verses supersede the earlier verses. So they do have some peaceful verses in the Quran, but amongst themselves they don't live by those any more than we live by the Old Testament. So in the Bible we have an Old Testament with some violence. In the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles never killed anyone. We say the later example is the one we're going to strive to follow. Well, that's the way it is in Islam, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first, and they were superseded and erased by the later verses that came in Medina, and they're the political, militant, violent ones. And in communism, they have a term called disinformation, where they intentionally put out a lot of confusing information so that it obscures what they're doing. And so the Quran is, in a sense, it puts out these Medina verses and Meccan verses, and it's disinformation so that it's hard for a non-Muslim to understand it. And so they throw up their hands and say, well, we'll let you tell us what it means. But when you look at the 1,400-year track record and you see these Christian areas being conquered. So the first Arab Spring went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean in Spain in just 100 years. And then you have the Turks convert to Islam, and they conquer into what is today Turkey. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. And so Ephesus and Galatia and Colossae, these cities that New Testament letters are written to, were all conquered by the Muslim Turks. One of the things I found important in discussing this is people say, well, Christians kill people during the Crusades. Muslims kill people too. Every religion has crazies that kill people, so it's sort of a wash. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Indeed, the Muslims had 14 centuries of crusades, and the Europeans only had 2 centuries of crusades. But rather than compare the followers, let's compare the founders. So if your computer acts up, what do? You reload the software the way it was when you bought it. If your religion acts up, what do? You go back to the way it was when it left the founder. So rather than compare the followers, let's compare the founders. The largest religion in the world is Christianity, about 33%. Second largest religion in the world is Islam, about 22%, followed by 16% unaffiliated, 15% Hindu, 7% Buddhist, down to 0.2% Jewish. So Christians and Islam. So let's compare the founders. Jesus never killed anyone. Muhammad killed an estimated 3,000 people. Jesus never led armies. Muhammad led armies. Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad got a fifth of the slaves taken in battle. Jesus never married. Muhammad had 11 to 22 wives. Jesus never tortured anyone. When Muhammad conquered Carver, the last Jewish settlement in Arabia, the chief refused to tell where the tribe's treasure was hidden. So Muhammad had the chief stretched out on the ground, and they kindled a fire on his chest to try to get him to tell where the treasure was hidden. Jesus did not lie. Muhammad permitted lying to the infidels so that you can subdue them. A story. There was a chieftain planning on attacking Muhammad. He goes to his warriors and said, "Who will rid me of the chieftain?" His one warrior said, "I will, if you permit me to lie." So Muhammad said, "Go." The warrior goes to the chieftain, says, "I've left Muhammad. He's a heretic. I want to help you, but they're after me." And the chieftain says, "Okay, you can spend the night in my tent. You'll have my whole army surrounding you. You will be safe." Well, in the middle of the night, this warrior tiptoes over and beheads the chieftain and grabs his head, runs all the way out of the camp, runs to Muhammad, gives Muhammad the guy's head, and says, "O Prophet, Allah's face is shown upon you." And Muhammad says, "Oh, Allah's face is shown upon you." And Muhammad gives him his staff and says, "You can lean on this in the day of judgment, because on that day many people won't have anything to lean upon." So Muhammad approved of lying to your enemy so that you can gain the advantage and behead them. One other story, a warrior of Muhammad's was captured, and he was forced to renounce Muhammad. He escaped and went back, and Muhammad forgave him. And Muhammad said, "If they make you turn, turn, but don't turn in your heart." In other words, it's okay to deny Muhammad in a pinch to save your skin, as long as you don't fight against Islam. In other words, it's okay to say you're not a Muslim in order to get elected, but then everything you do once you're elected is to help advance Islam. And so, anyways, so we have the two springs: the Arab Spring that conquers from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean, and then the Turkish Spring that conquers into what is today Turkey. And as they're conquering, all the Greek scholars are fleeing, and they flee to Florence, Italy, with their art and literature, and this causes the Renaissance. And then when the Muslims conquer Constantinople, it cuts off the land routes to India, and that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route to India. And anyway, finally you got the two biggest powers in the world. The Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent controls North Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, Persia, and into Eastern Europe. And his counterparts, the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor Charles V of Spain. Charles V is faced with a double dilemma. Protestant Reformation started in 1517 with Martin Luther, Muslim invasion surrounding Vienna, Austria in 1529 with Sultan Suleiman. So Charles V decides to strike a deal with the Protestants, and it's the very first treaty to recognize Protestants, the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. And this treaty said, "Look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these invading Muslims because they want to kill us all." And so that Treaty of Augsburg let the different kings believe different things. And in the next century, you had Germany as Lutheran, Switzerland Calvinist, Scotland Presbyterian, Holland Dutch Reformed, mass migrations of people shifting around Europe for conscience sake, and those were the ones that spilled over and founded colonies in America. But the Muslims were stopped at several famous battles: the Battle of Malta, September 11th, 1565 in the Mediterranean, the Battle of Vienna, September 11th, 1683 in Vienna, and finally, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was disbanded. France took a part of the old Ottoman Empire, Lebanon and Syria. Britain took a part of the old Ottoman Empire, Palestine, Iraq, Egypt, and gave birth to Israel out of that. They wanted America to take a part of the old Ottoman Empire, Armenia. We said no because we were isolationists, and the Muslims killed 1.5 million Armenians between 1915 and 1922. But for all practical purposes, the Ottoman Empire was gone. And the Muslim world decided to be ruled by secular leaders. And they said, look, Britain ruled the world for 2 centuries. America won World War I, World War II. The future is the West. And so like the Shah of Iran, who loved America, I met his son years ago, they would dress in Western business suits and send their kids to Western schools and teach English in their countries and adopt Western culture and styles and fashions. And it was moving in this direction until the Muslim Brotherhood was started in 1928. And they said, stop being friends with the infidel West, and they would target these secular presidents and kings and leaders, and the West would prop up these secular presidents, kings, and leaders, and until Jimmy Carter pulls the rug out from underneath the Shah of Iran and lets the fundamental Ayatollah take over. And Nixon did nothing when the Muslims killed 2.5 million Hindus in the 1970s because we were busy with Vietnam. I love Reagan, but when the Muslims blew up the Marine barracks in the 1980s and killed 241 Marines, his response was to leave. And then we have, our current president disinviting Mubarak, our ally. People forget Mubarak was in the bandstands with Sadat when there was a parade. The Muslim Brotherhood had infiltrated the Egyptian military, and they're having a parade. In the middle of the parade, they turn and spray the bandstands with machine gun bullets and kill the president, Sadat. Mubarak's wounded, but he survives. And so we're propping up Mubarak to crack down the Muslim Brotherhood. When Obama goes over to Egypt in his first speech in Cairo, he disinvites our ally, Mubarak, and he fills all the front rows with Muslim Brotherhood people. Then he sends his organizers over there so they can organize and have the Muslim Brotherhood take over Egypt. And then Obama, on his own, takes out Gaddafi, the leader of Libya. We were not at war with Libya, yet he uses our military to knock off a leader of a country. Why? So they can introduce democracy? Right, yeah. A year later, the Muslim Brotherhood has taken over Libya. And then we find out that most of Hillary's emails were inventory lists of weapons being moved from Libya through Benghazi to on these mid-sized ships to these mid-sized ports so they weren't noticed, and they were bringing guns to Turkey and Syria to arm the Muslim Brotherhood to take out Assad, another secular leader, so the Muslim Brotherhood can take over. The Muslim Brotherhood's goal is to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, their caliphate, their Islamic State. When Russia comes to Syria's rescue, these Muslim Brotherhood types, armed by America, trained by America, driving American Humvees and American guns, go into Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and they kill the Christians and call themselves ISIS. And so America, our president, our administration, helped create ISIS. And then we rush through funding to train Muslims, good Muslims, to fight the mad Muslims. As soon as they get armed and trained, they join ISIS. We are either the most inept world superpower arming the bad guy, or this is intentional. And then it takes on a different flavor when we see immigration. Hugo Chavez had been bringing Muslim terrorists over from Iran to Venezuela, teaching them Spanish and sending them north. So for a generation now, they've been infiltrating the drug gangs coming across our southern border. Remember all those children immigrants that they did, that they're spreading them all out around the country. They're basically Muslim gang leaders going into these cities. And now we see the Syrian immigrants. And the FBI admitted there's no way to do background checks. And so there's a really good chance that we're bringing these Muslims into America, spreading them out into cities. And the thought is, are we being set up for an Arab Spring? Simultaneous Baltimores and Fergusons and San Bernardinos all across America, maybe building up to a head before the next election. And in the middle of the crisis, somebody's going to say the president needs to declare this a national emergency. And that could be an excuse for the concentrating of power and going house to house and collecting guns and so forth. I hope that's all total speculation. I hope that's all wrong. But we are bringing them over, and there are no background checks. And we do see that the Muslim Brotherhood does have their agenda, and they're working. Anyway, I'll pause with that for a minute. Am I still with you?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Bill. Thank you for pausing. Sorry about that. Look, let's open it up for questions, folks. Press *6 to get in queue for any questions you may have, because you've covered a whole lot. Let me go back and get some clarity on a couple of things. This may help others. Press *6 to get in queue to ask your questions. The terrorists, are they primarily Sunni? Are they primarily Shia? Well, is there a breakdown between those two?
Right. They do have some differences. The Shiite pray 3 times a day. The Sunnis pray 5 times a day. The Shiites have muta, which is temporary marriage for pleasure. So they have whole classes of women that are passed around from husband to husband, and it's basically legalized prostitution. And so the statistics are there are less suicide bombers amongst the Shiites because they get their fulfillment, so to speak, through this muta, this temporary marriage situation, where in the Sunnis, the typical young male cannot even talk to a woman until he's like 30 years old and has a job and can support a wife, and so they get frustrated. There's a person, Tawfiq Hamid, who was a Muslim doctor in Egypt, and he joined the fundamentals and got involved with the violent people. Then he escaped and came to New Zealand, then to America, and he actually labeled it. He called it a sex deprivation syndrome. He says you go to these young guys, and he says that the imams in the mosques will describe paradise with the 72 virgins in very lustful, graphic terms to these young guys and get their lust stirred up, and then he sends them out on their suicide missions. And so there's more of the suicide bombers are Sunni than Shiite.
And Sunni, they claim to be basically to be following the direct descendants of Muhammad.
The Shiite claim the blood descendant. So Muhammad's daughter Fatima is married to Ali, and their son was Hussein. And so there were 12 male descendants of the bloodline of Muhammad. The last one was a 4-year-old boy shoved in a well, and that's the one they think is going to come back at the end of the world, called the hidden Mahdi. And he's going to usher in the return of Christ. But their Christ, it will kill all the Jews and kill all the Christians and kill all the apes and kill all the pigs. Basically, their Christ fits the exact description of the Antichrist. But those are the blood descendants. Now, the Sunni comes from the word sunnah, which means the way, and Muhammad's life example is the way. And Abu Bakr said, look, I was in every battle that Muhammad was in. I know him. I know the way. And so 90% of Muslims are Sunnis, followers of the way. That goes back to Muhammad's father-in-law, Abu Bakr. He was the father of Aisha, the 6-year-old.
Got it. So Sunnis are following what they claim they're following the way of Muhammad, whereas the Shia claim to be following the bloodline of Muhammad. They're in the bloodline and following those who are direct descendants of Muhammad. But you say the majority of Muslims are Sunni, overwhelming majority are Sunni.
Right, about 90%, and then there's the 10% are Shia. There's a very small fraction of what they call Salafists and maybe even some more spiritual ones, but they are not the ones to fit in the equation.
So the Saudis and the and the Iranians right now are at each other, and the Saudis then are primarily Sunni?
Saudis are Sunni, and so is Iraq, so is Turkey, so is the other Gulf states, and Iran is basically on its own as being Shiite. Now, they do support some of the different terrorist groups like Hamas, and they do both hate Israel. They do both hate America, and they I call it, in a sense, the religion of Cain. Cain wanted to worship God, but he did it through works. And we know it's works because God told Adam, the ground is cursed for your sake, and you'll bring forth fruit by the sweat of your brow. So here's Cain sweating, working, wanting to make his way into God's presence. And does his works work? No. Abel does the lamb thing. And it's this beautiful picture of God's on one side, man's on the other side, our sins separate us from God, and the lamb pays for the sin. And so when Cain's works were rejected, there's no lamb in the Islamic theology. And so when Cain's works were rejected, it says his countenance fell. What does that mean? His pride was hurt. He was offended. And what did he do? He got filled full of hatred and anger and murdered his brother that had the revelation of the lamb. And so here Islam is, they always are getting offended. You can't get offended unless you have pride. And pride is the sin of Satan. And so here we have the Cain getting offended and wanting to murder his brother. And so anyway, that's a little theological.
A couple of other questions, folks. Just press *6. We're going to come right to you. September the 11th, 1683 was the Battle of Vienna, in which I guess they turned back the Muslims. I've heard that they picked September 11th as the day of the attack, sort of as vengeance for the defeat on September 11th, 1683. Have you heard that? Is there any accuracy to that?
Yeah, well, there's three major battles. The Siege of Malta, September 11, 1565. That's when the Muslims were turned back. And then Battle of Vienna, you mentioned, was September 11, 1683. And then the Battle of Zenta, where 100,000 Muslims had invaded Serbia, and they were defeated on September 11th, 1697. And so you have to understand, Islam is like a team spirit. It's like a team. And so if your team loses the playoffs, how does your team regain its honor? It has to win the playoffs. And so it's not an individual religion. Matter of fact, in Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah, because he is transcendent and unknowable. Christians say that we're made in the image of God. In Islam, Allah has no image. Christians believe that we're children of God. In Islam, Allah has no children because he took no wife and has no son. And, so Islam, there's no personal relationship with Allah. It's a team spirit. It's a peer-pressured concept. And so they, there's no Holy Spirit convicting them to rape this woman but not that woman. So it's not an internal matter of fact, they actually have a verse. There's a verse that circumvents your Holy Spirit. It's Surah 2:216. It says, "Fighting is ordained for you as much as you dislike it. But it's possible you dislike a thing that's good for you and you love a thing that's bad for you. Allah knoweth and you knoweth not." So in other words, fighting, or you're out there beheading people and you say, I dislike this. I don't like doing this. And then it's going to say, you're not going to like it, but do it anyway. So you're being convicted in your spirit, that sinning is wrong, but then it's going to say, ignore this conviction. And so it's not an internal religion. It's an outward compliance. A couple interesting things. Is Sunnah, the way. And so Muhammad's life, what Muhammad permitted is permitted. That's called halal. What Muhammad did not permit is not permitted. That is called haram. So Muhammad liked cats. Cats are permitted. Muhammad did not like dogs. Dogs are haram. They are not permitted. So all of Sharia law is a long list of halals and harams, what's permitted and what's not. And it's the local imam that keeps the list. And you go to the imam, says, is this permitted? Yes, that's halal. Is this permitted? No, that's haram. And so it's not an internal reflection type of religion. And that's important for us to know.
So all three of these major dates were on September the 11th. So September the 11th was not just, it just didn't happen that day. They chose that date.
That was a major slapdown. That was the Gettysburg for the Confederacy. That was the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire. And so after that September date in 1683, their Ottoman Empire began to shrink until it finally was dismantled after World War I. And so for them to regain their honor, they have to rebuild their empire, but they want to pick that date. And so Erdogan, who is the head of Turkey, he's unique. After World War I, all these leaders wanted to be secular and be friends with the West. Well, Ataturk was the secular leader of Turkey, and he wanted to distance himself from the fundamentalist violent past, and so he outlaws the Arabic language. He outlaws the calls to prayer over the loudspeakers. He outlaws the fezzes and the burqas, and he makes them dress in business suits and cut their beards, and so Turkey's moving in a secular direction. And Ataturk put the military in charge of making sure the politics never gets crazy fundamental Muslim again. And it worked. And Turkey was a secular country until the current guy, Erdogan, got elected. He pretended he was a secular moderate. Once he gets in, he arrests all the generals that are supposed to keep him in check. And now he's turning Turkey back into a fundamentalist Muslim country again. And he's made it clear he wants to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. He wants to make himself the caliph. And America seems to be backing him.
Okay, we've got a bunch of calls, questions. So, folks, if you could keep your questions brief to the point, I'm sure it will help others who may have the same question you have. So, Bill, let's go to the questions.
Okay, first call comes in, phone number ending in, I believe it's 1462. You're on. Joyce? Hello?
Let's go to the next person.
Okay, next caller. Phone number ending in 6531. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, hi. This is Erin Anderson. Thank you so much
hi,
for
Erin.
a great presentation. Bless you. All right. Given everything you've provided to us, can you tell us who are listening to this what we can do here in the United States to push back on this?
One thing is to tell politicians to stop treating Islam like it's just a religion. It's more than just a religion, because Muhammad was more than a religious leader. He was a political and a military leader. And so if we look at Islam from the political military aspect, it's really no different than Nazism or communism. It's totalitarian. In a sense, it has a gang type of mentality. So you join a gang, you leave the gang, they want to kill you. You join Islam, you leave, they want to kill you. And so what if the Bloods and the Crips and the MS-13 gang took over a neighborhood and started calling themselves a religion? Should our police throw up their hands and say, oh, I guess you can take over the neighborhood and have your vigilante justice? What if the KKK or the mafia started calling themselves a religion? Oh, you're a religion. Well, then you can have your lynchings and your vigilante justice and take over and run your territories. What if Hitler would have called Nazism a religion? Oh, it's a religion. Well, then you can teach in schools that Jews are untermentioned. It's like, wait a second. At some point in time, we need to grow up and realize you cannot let a gang-style totalitarian political system take over simply because they wave a religion flag. And so what's the difference? The difference is equality. You only grant equality to those groups that grant equality. So, our founding fathers said all men are created equal. In Islam, they don't believe all men are created equal. Women are not equal to men. Infidels are not equal to Muslims. And so it's, in that sense, it does have a gang-style way of a political system.
Okay, let's go to the next question, Bill.
Okay, next question. Go ahead, Dr. Raj. You're up.
Thank you. This is Raj Edwards calling, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your book about America's, the quotations.
America's God and Country.
God and Country. And that needs to be in all our high schools. And when I asked in North Carolina that the high schools consider that, they said, we will think about it. Similarly, the colleges, the college universities and their libraries.
Okay, Raj, we'll talk about his books, but you got to get to your question because we are running out of time. We got a lot of people behind you.
The question is, how do we reach our schools and colleges and even where the State Department is drawing all its foreign policy experts, because even our academies are not teaching on neglecting all that you've so brilliantly and so wisely expressed. Even
got it. Thank you, Raj. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Raj. One of the things I found just 2 weeks ago, I was briefing some FBI and some police department. They had me down at their police department. I had a whole dozen of them. I'm going through this history. They said, well, gee, this is interesting. We're only taught not to offend Muslims. Wealthy Muslims have bought ownership in textbook companies. And so the textbooks being used have the 5 pillars of Islam in them. We need to pressure politicians because in Texas, a father went to the school board and says, what's my kid doing learning the 5 pillars of Islam? Why can't he learn Romans Road and John 3:16? And they said, well, this is mandated in the state curriculum. Who in the world was asleep to let the state have this curriculum where they're mandating? So they're basically proselytizing. And I mentioned in communism, they have a term called deconstruction, where you separated people from their past, get them into this neutral where they don't know where they came from so you can brainwash them into your communist future. It's a sales technique. If I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I'd do is say negative things about the toothpaste you're currently using. Oh, it'll eat the enamel off your teeth, and ooh, you're repulsed by it. Now I got you into this neutral where you're open-minded as to what's all out there, and then I can give you my pitch for this tartar-control breath freshener. And so what they do is they say negative things about the founders. They were slave owners. They took land from Indians, and ooh, the kids are repulsed by them. Then you get to the kids into this neutral where they're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? And then you can give them your pitch for this Common Core, LGBT, and the gay agenda and the Islamic agenda. And so we have to realize that they are working this process on our kids and intentionally wanting to disassociate with the past, get them into this neutral, and then brainwash them into the future. And we need to tell the politicians and our educators, no, our founders, for all their faults, they did produce the freest and most prosperous country with the most individual liberty of any nation that's ever existed on the planet. In the back of my book, I have a pledge title of the book's called What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, and in the back of it I have a pledge to protect women. And this is a way to get resistance to Sharia law in by going to the politicians and say, are you against beating women? And, of course, they're going to, well, yeah, I'm against beating women. So why are you letting this group in that says it's okay to beat women? What do you mean? Well, this is what it says in Sharia law. It says to beat women, and that's a primary tenet. I mentioned Tawfiq Hamid. He has a website where he goes through the ABCs of radical Islam. And so when a mosque says, well, we're not violent, say, okay, A, apostate. Are you going to preach that it's against killing apostates? B, beating women. Are you going to say to your congregation that it's no longer acceptable to beat women? C, calling Jews apes and pigs. Are you going to say that we're no longer going to call Jews apes and pigs? They can't do that. But what you do is you pressure politicians, say, okay, if you're against beating women, you can't allow this. Are you against polygamy? Are you against punishing victims of the rape? In Islam, if the woman is raped, it's her fault for allowing herself to be used as a tool of Satan to tempt the man. And so the woman gets whipped. We don't have that in our legal system. You're not supposed to punish the victim. And so it's pressuring these politicians. And so remember that guy that said, I wanted to burn the Quran? If he would have taken a little penknife and cut out one verse that says that Allah says it's okay to beat your wife if she disagrees with you, if he just would have burned that one single verse, who would have stood up to defend the Quran? Sometimes we make a mistake by attacking the whole thing when we're better off just saying, okay, let's get everybody on the page. We're not going to let some group come into our neighborhood that teaches it's okay to beat women.
Okay, next question.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Johnson.
Yes, I know the time is winding up, but could you, Brother Federer, give a brief synopsis of the Islamic influence in the slave trade as far as blacks being transported to America?
Right. The Muslims enslaved Africans for 700 years before America was ever discovered. In Arabic, they have one word for African and slave. It's abd, A-B-D, like Abdullah means slave of Allah. So abd means slave. And so every African they would call abd. And so they would castrate the men, make them eunuchs, sell the women through the sex trafficking. About a third of the tribe would die in the conquest, and then the elderly and young would not survive the forced marches to the Muslim slave markets through Timbuktu. And then they when the Spanish discovered the New World, the greedy ones enslaved Native Americans for about a generation. And then there was a Catholic priest named Bartolomé de las Casas, a contemporary of Martin Luther in Germany, but Bartolomé was in America. He spent his life getting the King of Spain to outlaw the enslavement of the Native Americans. And when he was finally successful, the greedy people say, well, where can we get more slaves? And someone said Africa. And they went to the Muslim slave markets, and they bought Africans, brought them to the New World. And so it continued. Even David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary to the Congo in the 1800s, writes about stumbling across a trail in the jungle of 1,000 Africans tied together being marched 500 miles to the coast to be sold into Muslim slavery. And if they walked too slow, they would just stab them or shoot them. And he says you could tell where the slave trails were by looking for the vultures circling. He said he goes through an area, and a year later goes back to visit, and the whole area was depopulated. He said ghost villages, because the Muslim slave traders came through and captured everyone. He says someone gave him a paddle boat, a little steam paddle boat to go up the rivers, and he said it kept breaking because it would hit the dead Africans that the Muslims would throw into the rivers. And he writes in his journal, he says, if anything in my life and travels and ministry can get rid of this monster cloud that hangs over Africa of the Muslim Arab slave trade, my life will be worth it. And so it still continues to this day. And so in Sudan, the northern Arab Muslims are enslaving southern African Christians. And so in Niger, Mauritania, and Sudan, and they call it by different names, forced marriages and sex trafficking, but it's slavery.
Okay, and folks, by the way, the Nation of Islam sold that to the black community by saying Islam is the religion of the black man. And Farrakhan is still selling that lie and sweeping a whole bunch of people into that nonsense. But let's go on to other questions. Go right ahead, folks. We're gonna hold this over. I don't think it's fair to not give you a chance. Bill, can you stay? Can you stay for maybe an extra 10 minutes? Okay, let's
Sure.
let's keep taking questions. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, next phone number ending in 7055. Go ahead, you're up.
Yes, this is Nancy Godfrey. I just want to thank you so much for this information. And I've been reading a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood and all, and you sort of touched on it by saying you present to the FBI and police. But to what extent do our elected officials understand the project and the whole plan of the Muslim Brotherhood and all this information that you've shared with us?
Very little. I was actually on a plane with a 30-year military intelligence officer, and he said, we were only told to read books to be sensitive to the Muslim culture. He says, we've never heard about Muhammad being a warrior and his tactics of warfare being unconventional and unpredictable. And I said, you have to understand, when you are really careful not to insult the Muslims, you are posturing yourself as having been conquered. So for 1,400 years, whenever Muslims conquer an area, the area they conquered, the people are forbidden to insult Islam. And so when you're really, really careful not to insult Islam, it's like crawling up to them on your knees, and you're posturing yourself as having been the conquered one. And so Saudi Arabia for years viewed our military as its slave army. Why? Because they would capture the Christians and they would make them slaves. They called them Mamluks in Africa. They called them Janissaries in Turkey, where they would attack a Christian area and they would demand not just their crops and their money, they would demand their boys. And so they would take these boys and they would sodomize them, called the sodomy of the Turks, and then they would turn them into soldiers, and then they'd put them on the front lines to attack the next Christian city. And there were, famous stories of them invading Romania and demanding 500 boys a year. And the Romanian king was Vlad III, and he didn't want to give any more Romanian boys up. And so he fought some battles, and he captured and impaled 20,000 Muslims. And so he was nicknamed Vlad the Impaler. And now he did not drink blood. That was something that was made up later. But he was a member of the Order of St. George of the Dragon Slayer, where these different kings in Eastern Europe vowed to fight the Muslim sultan called the Dragon. And in Romania, the pronunciation of dragon was Dracula. So here's Vlad III, a member of the Order to kill the Dracula. And but he was known. His idea was to out-terrorize the terrorists. And he kept the Muslims out of Romania from taking their boys, and so he's literally a hero in Romania. But anyway.
Wow. Okay, let's go to another question, folks. Don't sign up anymore. We got more questions we can probably handle now, but let's try to get all of the ones that we have now in. So let's go to the next person.
Okay, phone number ending in 2080.
Hi, this is Dr. Glenn Pinkney from North Carolina. Is it possible, Bill, that you could put together a brief paper that we might be able to email to our legislators, both locally as well as on a national level?
Yeah. I have put one together. I did it for Congressman Trent Franks a year ago. His chief of staff asked me to. But I literally compared Jesus and Muhammad, and it's very short. And then also I have my book as an e-book, and I'll be glad to email it to Bishop Jackson, and then he can forward it out to you. So if you just want to, email him, and then he can send it to you. And I don't care if you email the book. It's called What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, but I have it as an e-book, and then you can forward that to all your, politicians and church members. And I tell people I need to make a living, but I need a country to live in. And
well, Bill, we will be happy to send that out to our entire list. Anybody who wants to request it, though, just send it to us. Send us the request, and we'll get it out to you.
I think it would be great if we purchased the book as well.
Absolutely. We need to help Bill Federer live. He is a national treasure. Okay, let's go to the next question.
Yeah, and there's a link in the email announcing this call today to the books that Bill talked about today.
And the call is recorded, folks, so you'll also be able to refer others to it. They can listen to the entire call. Okay, next question.
Phone number ending in 6501. Go ahead, you're up.
Bishop Smith in Little Rock. Thank you, Dr. Federer.
Thank you.
What is your wisdom for the preacher, the pastor, the man of God? What is your wisdom for us?
Well, there's two goals. The most important thing is to bring people to Christ. The second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. So when Sharia law Islam takes over, it's the death penalty for you to tell somebody about Christ. If North Korean communism takes over, you're locked in a labor camp if you tell somebody about Christ. If the gay homosexual agenda has its way, they're going to censor and tell you what you can and cannot say about the gospel. And so if we're really concerned that the gospel is the answer, we're going to be involved wanting to preserve the freedom to preach the gospel. Now, I do want to throw in that the majority of Muslims are nonviolent. What do I mean? That means they really don't take it all that serious, and they just want to live their lives. And I have a friend, Zuhdi Jasser. He is a Muslim. He reminds me that 26 million Egyptians gathered together in Tahrir Square and had a demonstration and threw out the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, are Christians equal in Egypt? No, they're second-class citizens, very similar to the way that the Democrats treated the free blacks in the South after the Civil War. You know, on paper, they're free, but everybody knows that they were treated, with second-class treatment, and if they got out of line, they could get lynched. And so the Christians, that's a terrible chapter in American history, but it's an adequate description of how Christians are treated in these Muslim countries. But for centuries, these Christians learned how to survive as second-class citizens. I talked to one, he said that we survived by being the best doctor, the best engineer. They didn't like us, but since we were the best, they tolerated us, and so they got their neighborhoods, they got to survive. The Muslim Brotherhood wants to kill them all. It doesn't want any of this. And so anyway, so in Egypt, the 26 million got together and they threw out the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, Zuhdi Jasser reminds me, look, there's a lot of Muslims that don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. The problem is that our government has decided to back the fundamental ones in their quest to reestablish their caliphate and so forth. And so we need to pressure these politicians. So I use the way of explaining that in the last 70 years, since Islam is an RPM, it's a religious system, a political system, and a military system. If for a moment we set aside the religious aspect of Islam and just look at it from a political military side, it has, number one, a global conquest aspect to it, and number two, wherever it takes over, non-Muslims are not equal. Well, what political military systems had we faced in the last 70 years that had a global conquest aspect to them, and wherever they took over, non-adherents were not equal? Well, let's see. You had the Nazis. I'm half German, but in the 1930s, America said, look, we love the German, but we have to stand against this political military system of Nazism. Why? It has a global conquest aspect to it, and wherever it took over, non-Nazis are not equal. And we love the Italian, but we had to stand against Mussolini's fascism. And we loved the Japanese, but we had to stand against Emperor Hirohito's imperialism. And we loved the Russian, but we had to stand against Soviet communism. And we loved the Chinese, but we had to stand against Mao Zedong's collectivism. Well, today we love the Arab, we love the Indonesian, we love the Turk and the Pakistani, but we have to stand against political militant Islam. Why? It has a global conquest aspect to it, and wherever it takes over, non-Muslims are not equal.
Okay, Bill, let's go to the next question.
Okay, next phone number, Jim Kuiper. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, this is Jim Kuiper. I just had a question about which one of your, or many of them, literature, DVDs, wherever, would address the issue of the curriculum infestation that has occurred and how to address it and combat it.
I did two DVDs. One is called Political Islam's War on the West, and then another one is called Islamic Conquest, Past and Present. I do touch on the Gulen movement a little bit in those, but I have other resources on my website where I go through a little bit more. But there was a wealthy Turkish billionaire named Gulen, and he lives in Pennsylvania, and he was actually driven out of some of the countries for his fundamentalism, but he's actually helped create charter schools. So these are, it took years for Christians to finally get charter schools put in place in many states. Well, he's quickly come in and learned how to do this, and so now they're Muslim charter schools. They teach Islam. They take the whole staff, the families over to Turkey for field trips and treat them really well, and they come back to America, and they're like, oh, Islam's great. They bypass the fact that the Turks wiped out Christianity in that area of the world, but money buys access, and so they have this money, and they've the gay homosexual agenda has hated Judeo-Christian faith, and the Muslims hate Judeo-Christian faith, and so the gay left views itself as having something in common with the fundamental Muslims, and so it's I think David Howard's called it a marriage made in hell. But here you have they both work together. But the problem is, once Muslims take over, they'll kill the gay homosexual. So you look at Holland. Holland has been on the forefront of the sexual, gay movement, and now Holland is being inundated by Muslims. Most of southern Holland is now Moroccan Muslim, and there's one homosexual in the newspaper. He said, I only learned how to enjoy my liberties, never defend them. And so the gay homosexual agenda is very short-sighted. They just see, hey, we want to cut ties from the Christian past, and the Muslims want to cut ties with the Christian past. So, hey, we're sort of friends. But once the ties are cut, then the Muslims are just as happy to get rid of the gay homosexuals. And so they, sinned. Can't see the consequence. So, you got a wealthy businessman, and he has a pretty secretary, or a pastor and a pretty piano player, and all they see is that immediate pleasure. They can't see behind it and say, this is going to destroy my ministry, my family, my business, my job, my career. They don't see that. And so the gay homosexual agenda is very short-sighted. They just think of that immediate sexual fulfillment. They don't see behind it and say that, hey, we're just dismantling our civilization, and what's going to come in next is this a 1,400-year track record of Muslims setting up a totalitarian system.
Okay, next question.
I believe, Bill, that the Muslim Brotherhood had a big role as well in in affecting the curriculum, reflecting Islam in a favorable light in our textbooks.
Let's go to the next question.
It is phone number ending in 1462. Go ahead.
Hello. We have noticed that the Muslims come into our area and pray, and even we've come home and found them praying on our curb in front of our house, and they are taking over, being greatly involved in our banking, credit checks, fraud things, and I know there's a timeline that they have, and they seem to be very good at working in unity together. Can you tell us how that fits in the timeline and where we can find a copy of this timeline of their goals of when they're doing what?
Yeah, well, praying is claiming. And so when they pray somewhere, they are claiming that land for Allah. And so these naive churches that say, oh, we want to let the Muslims use our building, you don't understand, they're claiming your building. And when they pray 5 times a day, has anybody bothered to ask what it is that they're praying? Well, they're actually praying curses on Christians and Jews. And the specific wording, it says that Allah keep us from following the way of those who have departed from the way of Allah. And but the Muslims know that those who have departed from the way of Allah, they consider the Christians and the Jews. And so so when they're praying, they're not praying love your enemy. There is no verse in all of Islam that says love your enemy and do unto the infidel the way you want the infidel to do unto you. It's conquest. And so when they build the mosque, it's a symbol, it's a beachhead, it's a conquest. When we let 3,000 Muslims pray on our U.S. Capitol lawn, what would we think if Saudi Arabia let Billy Graham have a crusade and 3,000 people showed up? We would think we're making headway. And so when you understand that when we think that we're showing tolerance, they view it as submission. So in a Muslim country, the Christians have to get up out of their seat and give the Muslim the seat. The Christians have to let the Muslims go in the door in front of them. If there's a crowded sidewalk, the Christians have to get out of the way and let the Muslims go past. So in America, when we're just showing typical politeness, they view that as us showing deference and submitting to them. And so again, in nature you have domestic species and invasive species. Someone let a python loose in the Everglades, and there's no natural predators, and now these things are growing 40 feet long and swallowing cows and alligators. And somebody brought in a plant called kudzu in Georgia, and now it's like taking over whole forests. And somebody we got fire ants and killer bees, and somebody let the aquarium during Katrina empty into the Gulf, and now there are these lionfish that are taking over reefs in the Caribbean. And so ideologically you have domestic ideologies, which is doing to others as you have them doing to you. Even even Buddhism has karma, which is what goes around comes around. So you want to be nice to people because it's going to come back and kick you. So these are domestic type of ideologies. Islam is invasive. And wherever it takes over, it crowds out all previous cultures, all previous religions, all the previous languages. And in Egypt, the Muslims cut out the tongues of anybody caught speaking the Coptic Egyptian language. That's why they eradicated and brought in the Arab language. And there was a Muslim sultan who had a commission to raid the pyramids and take all their pyramid treasures and destroy them. And destroy the churches and destroy the Buddha statues in Afghanistan and the Hindu temples in northern India. So wherever they take over, they view all previous culture, religion, language. In the 50s in Turkey, they had what was called the Ottomanization. They wanted to restore the Ottoman Empire to its former glory. So to do that, they wanted to get rid of all non-Muslims, but they wanted to get rid of the Kurds too, because they spoke their Kurdish language. And so it's that team spirit aspect. It's very tribal. It's the tribal mentality is the most basic form of political unit in America that's come down to us as town football games and the rivalries that take place. Well, in Islam, it turns into warfare, not just rivalries, but it's a very team tribal spirit.
Okay, Bill, what do we have? One more question?
One more.
Okay, let's go to that one.
I think phone number ending in 7430. Go ahead.
Thank you, Bill, for all that you do. This is Mike Valerio talking. And how could we go about, and I'm not sure how, but how would you go about getting this message to every U.S. congressman and senator and even presidential candidates? Has this been tried? Because until they know about what we just heard, nothing is going to change.
Right. Well, politicians want to get elected, period. And so if they think that you can help or hinder their getting elected, you've got their attention. And so I spoke in probably 50 meetings for Concerned Women America for across this country. I said, you need to show up at your politicians' town halls and call them wife-beating pedophile chauvinists. And they go, what? I say, yeah, you let this mosque in, you let these immigrants in, and they believe that it's okay to beat wives. So you must be in favor of that. They believe that you can have 6-year-old wives. So you're in favor of pedophilia. They believe in female genital mutilation. Where I've talked to nurses that have worked in emergency rooms in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they said that the Muslim communities, they send these girls in with quote-unquote accidents, and the girls have the whole thing cut off. And it's like, look, this isn't an accident. They do this because in Islam only the man can have pleasure. And so it's just, if the politicians are allowing this in, they must be in favor of it, and we need to call them on the carpet. One other thing we need to start doing is lawsuits. I think we need to sue the president if property values go down because of Muslim immigrants coming in. You need to sue the states. You need to say, wait a second, the government is formed to protect our private property. And if the government is making decisions, we do that with bars coming into neighborhoods. They have to go around and get approval from the neighbors to say, okay, you're going to have a bar within 100 feet of your residence, or an adult business is going to be, within a quarter mile of a school. And the people of the neighborhood have time to show up at town halls, or they have to vote to permit this for the liquor licenses. And so Why is that? It's because that institution may cause your property value to decline. And so we need to do the same thing. Hold these if the politicians are doing something where property value declines, and sure enough, it's provable wherever a mosque is built, mark it on your calendar, within a number of years, the majority of the people living around that mosque are going to be Muslim. There's a demographic change. And so the politicians that are allowing this need to be held personally accountable.
And Bill, before we let you go, what about pastors? Because most pastors don't have this information either. And what you said, the most telling thing I think you've said, and you said a lot of stuff, but what jumps out at me is this idea that if you're simply trying to be kind or trying to be gracious or trying to be mannerly or simply trying to be respectful, that often Islam or Islamists or even Muslims may interpret that as weakness or Allah giving them the territory or giving them supremacy. So, and not that we shouldn't be mannerly with everybody, but not criticizing Islam, not calling it out for what it is, it really is a sign of submission. So how do pastors get this message?
Parents have to struggle with this. Are you going to be the nice parent all the time, or are you at some point going to have to lay down the law and tell the kid this is behavior that is unacceptable? And so it's the same way that you love your child, you love the people in your community, but you're going to have to learn how to be pastors that have some guts and say, look, this is something that is, Jesus said, if you allow a little one to stumble, it's better that a millstone be put around your neck and you throw in the depths of the sea. What are we allowing being taught in the schools now? All this, sexual immorality and now Islam. And so we're allowing this. In America, the people are the king. This is an important concept that I get into in my other talks. But John Jay was the first Chief Justice in America. John Jay says, in America, the people are the sovereign. The people are the king. And so if the people are the king, what does that make the the pastors? The pastors are counselors to the king. 70+% of Americans identify themselves as Christian. 70% of Americans identify themselves as Christian. That means they're going to some pastor's church. And so the pastors are counselors to the king. In 379 AD, the Roman Empire was Christian, and the Roman emperor was Theodosius, and he's going to church in Milan, Italy, and the pastor is Bishop Ambrose, St. Ambrose. And there's a famous painting of St. Ambrose rebuking the emperor Theodosius. Could you imagine being St. Ambrose and having the emperor in your church on Sunday? Well, guess what? You do. The people are the king. 70% of America is Christian. They're going to church, and they're having pastors talk to them. And so there's two types of counselors to the king. If you saw the movie The Lord of the Rings, there's a famous scene of a King Theoden that has his spell cast on him. He's got gray hair, gray eyes, and he's just really totally out of it, and his kingdom is being overrun. And he has two counselors. One is a guy named Wormtongue, and he whispers in the king's ear, stay asleep, don't get involved, separation of church and state, just wait a little longer and it'll all be over. And then there's another guy that comes in to talk to the king named Gandalf, and he sort of casts the devil out of him. And in the front of the camera, you see the king going from being gray-haired, his eyes get clear, and his hair gets shorter, and it turns red, and his beard gets shorter, and then he says, dark have been my dreams of late. And it's like, yeah, you've been out of it. And Gandalf says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword. And so we have the people are the king, and there's two sets of pastors, counselors to the king. One says, stay asleep, and the other says, wake up. You don't just have the privilege of voting in America. You will be held accountable to God for what happens in America. And so the pastor comes in and throws a bucket of ice water on his congregation and says, wake up. You're going to be held accountable for what happens, you, the people. And so Martin Luther King Jr. says that the church is the conscience of the state. We are supposed to be telling the state what it can and cannot do.
Okay. Well, listen, Bill, I can't thank you enough. I think this has been enlightening. I have never seen a call where so many people have stayed on for this long to hear what you have to say. So this has been enlightening. Folks, I do not have time for a closing peroration, if you will. Take this information, run with it. We will get you additional information from Bill Federer. Invite him to your church. Invite him to your organization to speak. This man has information that every single American ought to know, because we are facing an existential threat. And based on what we learned today, it is even more clear than it's ever been before that Islam is an existential threat to the United States of America, not only violently, but in terms of the infiltration of and the subjugation of our culture to Islam. We can't allow that to happen. God bless each and every one of you. We'll be back next week, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, next Tuesday. God bless. Talk to you then. Thank you, Bill.